So a couple weeks ago, we talked about Resident Evil Survivor here on the channel, and you guys might remember that while I thought there were some positive aspects to it, I really didn't enjoy the game overall. So you can imagine my excitement when after a quick 1-week return to some classic RE, I got to sit down at the beginning of this week to play through and review Resident Evil Survivor 2. The history behind this one is actually pretty interesting, as it wasn't actually supposed to be a sequel to RE Survivor when it first entered development. Survivor 2 was originally a joint effort between Capcom and Namco to make an arcade game that ties into the Resident Evil series, with them choosing to base the machine off of the recently released Resident Evil Code Veronica. It was originally announced and marketed in Japan as Biohazard Firezone, but the name would be changed to Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica about 2 months before its release. The arcade cabinet would eventually come out and be incredibly successful in Japan, with it being listed as the most successful dedicated arcade game in the entire country back in 2001. Capcom, likely wanting to ride out the success even more, would even make a home console port for the PS2 a few months later, one that would only ever be released in Japan and Europe. For whatever reason, North America never actually got a release of Survivor 2 in any capacity. No arcade machines, no PS2 versions, nothing. But not to worry, because I've gone to one of my least favorite websites on the internet, eBay, and imported a European version of the game to play and talk about here today. So does Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica manage to improve over its predecessor, or does it end up being another poorly made spin-off of the series? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 6th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. While you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing some context about my journey with those games if you haven't seen them. So for those of you that want to check those out first, I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica is a lightgun shooter game developed and published by Capcom in 2001 as an arcade cabinet and later ported to home consoles. The game is essentially an arcade-style speedrun through the environments of Resident Evil Code Veronica, but those who have played that game will notice that things are very different here. It almost feels like you're running through a Bizarro universe version of Rockford Island, which actually kind of makes sense since the ending of the game reveals that the entire thing was just a dream of Claire Redfield's. That might sound like I've spoiled the entire game already, but there really isn't a story here at all, as it was developed with the intention of just being an arcade machine. I'm really not lying or exaggerating to you when I tell you that the game just throws you into things and lets you shoot the zombies, and the "it was all a dream" ending is simply a justification for them to throw in whatever enemies and areas they wanted here. Anyway, getting into the game itself, Survivor 2 has a lot of different modes available on the console version, but the main game is found inside of the arcade mode. When starting this up, players will be given the choice to play as either Claire Redfield or Steve Burnside, with both characters having some very slight gameplay differences. The two of them don't have different stories or anything like that, as the two characters work on escaping Rockford Island together here. So whichever character you don't choose will still accompany you throughout the game as an AI partner. Each character will get their own unique set of weapons to play through the game with each having their own strengths and weaknesses. Claire gets the same M93R handgun that we saw her using in Code Veronica, and is also able to find things like assault rifles and magnums throughout the environments. Much like the first Survivor game, the basic handguns here will have infinite ammo, but the weapons you find in the environments will all have limited amounts of ammunition. So if you play as Claire, you'll primarily be using her M93R while using the assault rifle and the magnum in very select situations. If you use these stronger weapons just for the hell of it, you'll find yourself stuck with the handgun in more difficult encounters and boss fights, leading to a lot of deaths that could have been easily avoided by just saving that higher tier ammo. So much like the classic Resi games, when you find magnum ammo here, you shouldn't so much as touch it until you come to a boss fight. As for Steve's weapons though, you'll get his dual Lugers to fill your basic handgun slot with, and will be able to find dual machine guns and grenade launchers throughout the environments. Steve's handguns and submachine guns have a much higher damage output than Claire's M93R or assault rifle, but his grenade launcher won't absolutely nuke the bosses the same way her magnum does. This leads to a fairly interesting difference between the two gameplay-wise, as Steve will generally have a much easier time moving through the stages, but Claire will have an easier time in boss fights. After playing through the game a few times as each character, I think that Steve is generally easier to play the game as, but I definitely found myself wishing I had that magnum for the boss fights. So if you ever get the chance to play Survivor 2 for yourself, I would actually recommend that you play as Steve if you find yourself having a hard time. Which you most definitely will be, but we'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. As far as the basic gameplay loop goes, like I said before, it's basically just an arcade-style speedrun through Rockford Island. You'll be dropped into these small stages that are filled with enemies, and will typically need to find 1 or 2 keys before being able to make your way to the exit and move on to the next stage. Within each of these stages, as many of you have probably already noticed, the environments, music, and enemies have all been taken straight over from Code Veronica. Not everything in the game has been taken straight over from CV though, with some enemies like Lickers and Drain Deimos appearing from RE2 and 3 respectively. Each stage in the game is also topped off with a boss fight, and almost every single one of these are actually pretty difficult. There's a nice progression to them though, with the giant spider boss from the first stage being the only real easy one, and with each boss getting progressively more difficult, all the way up to a tyrant fight in the final stage. And probably the craziest twist in the video so far is the inclusion of the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. You've probably noticed the timer at the top of the screen already, but each stage has a set amount of time before the Nemesis gets dropped into the map. Players will have to rush around to try to grab the keys and reach the exit before Nemesis appears, because once he does, it does not take long for things to go to shit. Nemesis is completely invincible to damage here and capable of killing both you and your AI companion in a single hit. So if you spend too long in a stage, you'll then have to try to complete the rest of it with an unstoppable force roaming around that will kill you the moment he touches you. An appearance from Nemesis was probably the last thing I was expecting going into this game, but I have to admit that his inclusion does an amazing job at forcing players to move quickly through the levels and preserve that fast arcade pacing that the designers wanted. So overall, I'm a pretty big fan of his inclusion here. Another way that the game encourages you to play quickly is by including a scoring system. Of course, since this was made to be an arcade game, you'd expect a scoring system like this to be here so that players can strive for the high score on whatever machine they're playing on. You get a small amount of points for doing things like killing an enemy or breaking boxes, but most of the score you'll get is going to come from the bonuses that you receive at the end of each stage. Playing the game quickly is of course something that you'll get a bonus for, with faster completions of a stage leading to progressively larger point bonuses. There are also 2 flat bonuses on each stage for taking no damage while completing the level, or for only using your handgun and not even touching any of the additional weapons you can find. On top of the game adding up your total score at the end of a run, you get a letter grade for your completion of each individual stage, encouraging players to play as well as they can at all times. Like I said, you'd expect the scoring system to be here because this is an arcade game, but I really enjoyed how much it encouraged me to actually learn the game's mechanics and systems and push myself to get better at it with every run. And improving with every run is basically a necessity in this game because this one is hard. Like, really hard. Again, this likely comes from the game's origin as an arcade machine. If you've somehow never played an arcade game like this before, these games tend to be incredibly difficult because the more the game kills you, the more coins you're going to have to put into the machine if you actually want to play more of it. So the baseline difficulty is really high here, on top of the game having a ton of what I like to call arcade game bullshit. Stuff like walking into a room and having a licker leap at you and hit you before you've even fully loaded in. Meaning the only way to really avoid damage from the attack is to memorize the levels and know that you have to step to the left as soon as you enter that room. This leads to a game that can be really frustrating, but for some reason, I found myself weirdly nostalgic for this stuff. Any of you who grew up going to arcades and playing lightgun shooters will probably remember how a lot of them would throw random bullshit at you like this, so it almost took me back to being a kid in an arcade. It's definitely frustrating and just flat out bad game design by home console standards, but it's something that pretty much every arcade game did back in the day, and I found myself just sitting there and smiling when it would happen because it made me remember just how hard these games would try to get more coins out of you. The continue system from Survivor 1 makes a return here as well, so Survivor 2 will take you many tries to complete a run of. If you haven't seen my video on the first Survivor game, this means that you have 3 continues per run, and if you die a 4th time after using all of them, you'll get a hard game over and have to restart the entire game. Thankfully though, the game has some solid unlockables that will not only keep you playing, but also just make the game easier. The biggest of these is that the game will actually give you more continues per run, literally just for investing more hours into the game. Having more lives obviously makes it a lot easier to complete a run of the game, and by coincidence, completing a run will also increase the strength of your AI partner, meaning that they'll be far more helpful on any run you do after that. Oh, and I actually forgot to write this in here, but your AI partner can die pretty easily in this game, and when they do, they won't come back until you die and use a continue. Your AI partners aren't very useful when it comes to actually killing enemies, but having enemies chase after them instead of chasing after you can go a super long way when you're trying to save your continues up for later in the run. So having your AI partner become stronger is actually a pretty huge upgrade, just so that they can draw the enemies away from you. While the game is super hard, these things will make it a lot easier to complete if you're persistent enough and just stick with it. And to get the best idea of how fair or unfair the game is, I actually dedicated myself to not using any of the unlockables until I had completed a full run of the game at least once. So I can tell you that in my experience, it took me 6 tries to get good enough at the game to be able to beat it. That might sound like a lot, but a complete run of Survivor 2 will run you about 40 minutes. So with the failed attempts included, it took me a little over 3 hours to go from booting up the game for the first time to completing it. And just to emphasize again, that's without using any extra continues or any unlockables that I earned while playing. So while the game isn't necessarily fair, it's also not so ball-bustingly hard that beating it without unlockables would take an unreasonable amount of time. And you might have noticed by now that this video has been almost entirely positive. That's because I decided for this video, I wanted to talk about basically everything I like about Survivor 2 before getting into the things that I don't like. That way, the positives that are here hopefully won't get completely drowned out by the negatives like what happened in my video about Survivor 1. So for those of you who came in here expecting more of a critical lashing, buckle up because here we go. First things first, you've almost definitely noticed on your own already that the HUD in this game is fucking terrible. Everything that it sets out to communicate to the player is valuable and should be there, but it's all just so big that it takes up way more of the screen's real estate than it really should. I mean, seriously, the amount of visual clutter from the HUD sometimes can be absolutely insane, and it makes the game really rough to play unless you're already super familiar with it. Oh, and the on-screen map doesn't even properly line up with the level geometry a lot of the time, so that's nice. Another major flaw in this game is that the control scheme sucks again. It's different from Survivor 1 in a decent amount of ways, and while it is slightly better than what we got there once you've adjusted, it's still not very good. To start, strafing has been added much like I had wished in Survivor 1, but the way that they've bounded on the controller is a bit strange. So pushing the thumbstick forward or backwards will still move your character forward or back as you'd expect, but pushing the stick left or right will lead to you strafing to the left or the right rather than rotating like in Survivor 1. And you might think that since this is now a PS2 game, that of course means that the looking around part is handled by the right thumbstick. But you'd be wrong because once again, this came out about half a year before Halo Combat Evolved did, so the dual analog thing wasn't really popular yet. So rotating your view to the left or right has been moved to L1 and R1 respectively, which is just a bit weird to get used to. Add on to that the on-screen cursor from the first game has been removed, so you now aim simply by using L1 or R1 to rotate your viewpoint. Like I said, it does allow for more smooth and precise gameplay once you've gotten used to it, but your first hour or so of playing the game just feels really awkward because of how they've bound the controls here. Another complaint that I have is that the classic RE door transitions return here, but they just really don't fit with the tone or the pacing of the game. Now, hold your pitchforks, this isn't going to be some Resident Evil heresy where I say that the door transitions are bad. I love them to death, but they have to be used properly. In the classic RE games, these are used to not just mask the loading screens between rooms, but also to maintain that sort of slow building and creepy tension while the game is loading in the next area. But in a game like Survivor 2, where you're quite literally racing through the levels as fast as possible and blasting as many monsters as you can along the way, they not only feel super out of place tonally, but they also eviscerate the pacing of the game. I mean, having a 7-second animation of a door slowly creaking open doesn't really lend itself too well to being a fast-moving badass who's improving at the game and moving more quickly with every run. Like I said, these things are great in the mainline games, but they're just super out of place here in Survivor 2. Lastly, an admittedly small complaint considering how little story there is here, but there's no voice acting in Survivor 2. In the small handful of cutscenes that we get here, Claire, Steve, and whoever else they might run into just get subtitles at the bottom of the screen. There's so little story in this game that it really isn't much more than a small nitpick, but I thought it was worth mentioning mostly because of the poor English translation in the European release. A lot of the dialogue is just really stiff and awkwardly written, and Steve also calls Claire sis throughout the entirety of the game. No, really, it's weird. It's almost like whoever translated the game got Steve Burnside and Chris Redfield confused. That's honestly about it for the big standout negatives for me though. The game definitely still has its weaknesses, with most of them being pretty major flaws that hold the game back by quite a bit, but it's not quite the exhaustive list that I had for Survivor 1. It's a bit weird because I did some looking around on the internet to see what other players generally thought about Survivor 2, and found that most people seem to think it's an even worse version of the original Survivor. I personally disagree, but before wrapping up the video entirely, I have a couple more miscellaneous notes here. To start, there are some secret bits of lore that can be found during the arcade mode here, and some of these are pretty enjoyable. My favorite of the handful that I found while playing was a note that Steve's father wrote for him before ultimately succumbing to the T-virus. Just little things like that that take some effort to find and almost make you wish that Survivor 2 was part of the series canon. On top of that, there are a ton of modes available in Survivor 2. The most substantial of these additional modes is the dungeon mode, where you choose which character you want to play as and attempt to fight your way through these massive dungeons while scavenging for healing items and ammo as you go. Unlike arcade mode, handgun ammo is actually limited here, so it's entirely possible to fail a dungeon mode run because you run out of ammo. There's a ton of stages to complete in this mode, and each of them offers a more difficult challenge than the last. Each stage also has a bunch of fun challenges that you can go back for if you want to get some more playtime out of Survivor 2. Dungeon mode is also host to a bunch of new unlockables, with players even being able to unlock infinite ammo weapons like the classic RE games, or entirely new playable characters like what you'd expect to see in a Mercenaries mode. I didn't play enough dungeon mode while recording for this video to unlock everything, but if Survivor 2 ends up being your thing, it honestly adds a ridiculous amount of content and replayability to the game. Overall though, I think that Survivor 2 is still a deeply flawed experience that doesn't hold a candle to the mainline RE titles. However, I think that it has stepped up the quality quite a bit from the first Survivor game. Honestly, I think the one thing that I appreciated the most about Survivor 2 was how it fully embraced its identity as an arcade shooter. The original Survivor felt like it had this weird disconnect where it wanted to be an arcade shooter, but it also wanted to be a slow-paced atmospheric horror game at the same time. Survivor 2 ditches that entirely and just lets you get in there, run through the levels as fast as possible, and blast zombies along the way, which I really thought made it feel a lot better overall. Now, when we judge it as a home console game, it's obviously going to come out looking a little rough. The side modes and all the additional content for the PS2 version are great, but the main game has a runtime of 40 minutes, and that length is simply padded out by some pretty extreme difficulty. So depending on who you are, this one may or may not be worth looking into. If you have some nostalgia for those early 2000s arcade shooters like I do, you'll probably get at least a decent amount of enjoyment out of this one. But if you're looking for something that feels like a proper Resident Evil game, this one definitely won't be for you. It's a game that I really do appreciate in some ways as an old school arcade title, but as a PS2 game, it just doesn't hold up all that well. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica a 4.7. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way through this one. If you made it this far, I'm assuming you enjoyed what you saw, and if you did, then maybe consider checking out my Patreon or YouTube memberships. Support like this really helps keep the channel running, plus you get things like early video access and your name up here with all the other generous contributors. If you're not interested or just unable to though, don't worry, because just watching the videos all the way through already goes a super long way. So if these sort of videos are your thing, I'll have the rest of my RE series linked right here on the screen, and until next time, I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.